Hello and welcome to our module today, which will be about myth and ritual. So as we get started, we're kind of moving into a new phase in our book, Comparing Religions. So the next 6 modules are really going to be actually doing comparison instead of sort of looking at the history of the term religious studies or the academic study of religion. We're going to just step right in and do some comparing and look further at various analytical categories, but we're going to do them in kind of a less historical manner. Now, the key to understanding comparison is that it has 4 steps, as Kripal has told us over and over again, and I keep reminding you. You locate 2 traditions, you identify patterns within those traditions, then you compare those patterns toward finding or proposing a general theory of religion. After a really good comparison, someone will find new insights into each of the items prepared. Late in our chapter, Kripal is going to propose a comparison between the founders of Buddhism, i.e. Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, and Mahavir, the founder of Jainism. He's going to argue that you can take A, the founder myths of Buddhism, and B, the founder myths of Jainism, to C, do the project of engaging foundation myths or myths about founders. But I would add, what happens when you compare the Buddha and Mahavir is you get a clearer understanding of these 2 founders. You get a greater understanding of their common context because possibly their lifespans overlapped, but they did not know each other. We get varied notions of enlightenment or religious attainment because their liberation narratives, while similar, have striking differences that are reflected in the philosophies of both religions. Also, both of these characters founded monastic orders. So that in of itself is interesting. So these are some of the ideas that can come out of something like comparing the founders of Buddhism and Jainism. The key thing here that I want you to note is that good comparison creates new insights. It does not merely catalog similarities or differences. In fact, what we're looking for patterns, not individual data points. So in a comparative project, and if I was comparing Buddhism and Jainism, I don't just say they had notions of the soul, namely Buddhism says there is no soul and Jainism says there is a soul that is enmeshed in the world, and only through unenmeshing it will it be able to be free from pain. So I'm not just going to put those up there and say, oh, okay, there's a difference. We're looking for patterns. So we would be looking to what are the notion of the self or lack of self? What does that tell us about the later philosophies? What influences they might have had, how they could be working in a similar spectrum of understanding of the self. All right, so as my teacher, John Grimes, used to always say, comparison for comparison's sake is odious. So we are going beyond comparison to find new insights into religion in general or into those religions we are comparing. So today we're going to be talking about myth and ritual, and we're going to start with myth. Now, myth, mythos, mytheme, mythology, here are some of the terms that we're going to be looking at today. So what is a myth? Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a myth is a traditional story, typically involving supernatural beings or forces, which embodies and provides an explanation, an etiology, or justification for something such as the early history of a society, a religious belief, or a ritual, or a natural phenomenon. That word etiology, which is a nice little word, is a reason for something to have occurred or to exist. So what does myth do? Well, we often confuse myth with just a story, and there's this great Latin word fabula, and in fact the Romans would connect this notion of myth, of mythos, with just a story. But a myth isn't just a story. A myth is a story that leads to a greater truth. They're not literally true. So if I say there's, the earth floats on an ocean on the back of a turtle and it's turtles all the way down, I don't actually mean that, or maybe I do. That's the interesting point. I mean to be talking about the nature of the earth and the earth's existence and how it swims through the cosmos. So when somebody says, oh, that's just a myth, like they say the climate change myth, or they would say, use my progressive politics, the myth of trickle-down economics. They would say, what's another thing that people just say, that's just a myth, or it's just a hoax. So a myth, as we use it in our connotation in our daily life, means something that's not true. It's not an actual thing. It's just a myth. But when we're talking about myths, we're not talking about something that's not true. We're talking about stories and often narratives that make sense to the world, that give the world meaning. So what is a cosmos? So cosmos, well, the majority of myths are called, are not the majority, but quite a few myths are cosmogony or cosmology. Cosmogony is how the world exists, how the universe exists, and cosmology is a discourse into the cosmos, so how the world exists. Cosmogony, how it got created. Cosmology, how it works. What's this word cosmos? We have a sense of cosmos as being the whole universe. Cosmos inherently in the root of the word means the world existing in an ordered manner. So cosmos as opposed to chaos, the unordered world. So what do? Well, what do myths do? Well, myths sort of make sense of things. The intriguing thing about a myth is a lot of people would say that you can look at comparative myths as an outsider, as Kripal says, but as an insider, myths are literally true. So if you believe God made the earth in 7 days, according to Christianity, and you're a Protestant who's a literalist, you'd say, yes, God actually made it in 7 days. Other arguments could be that, well, those 7 days are metaphorical for ages of time that got created throughout the world. You could say that, those 7 days were his 7 breaths. You could say all sorts of different arguments to interpret that myth, to interpret that story. One argument is that he made the earth on 6 days and on the 7th day he rested. Well, of course he did, because the early Hebrews were, the writers were the priests who maintained the Sabbath on the 7th day of the week. Thereby, they read that into the myth. So the myth proves the particularities of a particular culture. Or in the Rig Veda, from Hinduism, they have this story of the cosmic man, and it is said that from his head comes the Brahmins, from his arms comes the Kshatriyas, these are the different castes, from his waist comes the Vaishyas and his thighs, and from his feet come the Shudras, the laborers. So the people that wrote it were writing in explanations for their particular culture. Again, if you are a mythologist and you look at a wide range of myths, you come to a little problem. They can't all be true. So you believe that the one myth, say, you know, that you believe in the cosmic man who was divided up to create the whole universe. Well, if you look at other myths, clearly there are different myths for cosmogony. Maybe none of them are actually correct. Maybe looking for the correct myth is a flaw. In reality, we study mythology in order to understand how people make sense of their cultures and of their lives. So here's 4 quick terms. We have mythos, which becomes myth, mythos from the Greek. And that actually really first gets used in 1769 by a German scholar. So before then, the idea of studying myth and mythology, which seems to be such a standard thing that we do in religious studies and in literature, wasn't even an idea. It hadn't even entered the European understanding of the world. So, and like I'd said earlier, this notion of myth as, or mythos as just being a story or a fabula does get worked back as far as the Romans. Then you have mythos, which is from the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, a body of interconnected myths or stories, especially those belonging to a particular religious or cultural tradition. Here's some good ones from pop culture. You have the Cthulhu mythos. So this is the writings that are based on H.P. Lovecraft that are not written by H.P. Lovecraft. People like August Derleth and S.T. Joshi write in a genre called the Cthulhu mythos, those myths about this god Cthulhu. Or the Star Wars mythos. So you think about the whole mythology and structure of Star Wars, and you see that you have the first 3 movies and a whole universe there, and then you have all these other media around it, such as, say, The Mandalorian, which everybody's been watching in whatever season they're in now. That's very much in the Star Wars mythos. Then you have mytheme. This is a term that's not used as much in the academy, but I quite like it. A mytheme in structuralist anthropology and literary criticism is a set of fundamental generic units of narrative structure, typically involving a relationship between a character, an event, and a theme, from which myths are thought to be constructed. So they're like the building block themes that all myths are made of, like a hero's journey, or the earth coming out of a yam, or the origins of death coming from human limitations. So a theme that goes across myths that you see that myths are built off of. And finally, mythology. So we've had this term logos quite a bit. Logos means discourse, inquiry, the word, knowledge, insight. So it's insight or knowledge about myth. So mythology is sort of the opposite of, let's say, philosophy. So philosophical theory would have propositions about the world. Mythology would tell you a myth to make sense of the world. So while Plato may argue that our senses, while Plato may argue that our senses dictate the way we see the world, he tells the allegory of the cave, in which people are strapped, there are prisoners in a cave and it's dark, and there are people behind them, and there's a light behind them, and people walk between them and the light, and they hold up objects, and the prisoners just see the shadows. They think the shadows are real. If someone was to break out, they'd go outside and they'd see the light and they'd see the real world and say, whoa, everything I was seeing was just images on a wall. And then they'd run back in and say, hey guys, we gotta get out of here. Because if we're just looking there, we're only seeing the images on the wall. We're not seeing the real world. And they say, no, that can't be the case. So that's the allegory of the cave. And it's a greater sort of story that tells us all sorts of things about understanding how we see the world, how people react to others who have insights into the actual nature of the world, the allegory of the cave. So it's mythology, not as much philosophical theory. All right, so for the insider, for one who is inside as opposed to outside of a tradition, so one who grew up in a tradition or converted to a tradition, myths are inherently true. They are literally true. But when an outsider looks at it, they would say that these stories seem all made up. So there's that difference of insider or outsiders. Now, I wonder, what are our own myths in the world? We have some myths like God created the earth. That's a mythological statement. The founding fathers created the perfect nation of the United States, and exactly as it was meant to be, whereas in reality, they were very human people who were trying to create a more perfect union, and had some strengths, had some weaknesses. But when we talk about, say, Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton or George Washington, think about George Washington, who could never tell a lie, and he had to admit when he cut down the cherry tree. That's total mythology. There aren't literal stories, though they might be, but they tell us more about the truth, such as the founder of our country, the first president, was so inherently honest. Go back in time, he was just as human as anyone else. So what about some other ones? The earth is round, the earth is flat. I mean, when people used to tell the stories of the earth, sort of in the Hebraic world, the idea was we lived on this plane, and then above it was heaven, and then between the heavens and the earth was the firmament, so this sort of interstitial space between earth and heaven, and windows would open and water would pour down out of them. Well, clearly that's not true, but it lets us, the mythology lets us get into and try to understand the way people saw themselves in the world. But we have a bunch of other myths. What about Steve Jobs? Everybody, the myth of the genius, our Steve Jobs, our Elon Musk, our these geniuses who supposedly, founded everything and were perfect engineers, when really, they were human beings who bumbled onto things and made accidents and had some insights and whatnot. But what is the advantage of the myth of the genius? Or what about other myths or stories we tell? What is this story about Spider-Man, that a radioactive spider can bite a man and then that man becomes having superpowers? Well, let's go further on that. It's about how every nerdy kid deep inside of them has a brave, powerful spirit, and if just something could happen, then they could become superheroes. They could become even more than man. So the superhero myth is a mythology and a mythos of our contemporary world. So Kripal sets out 3 sets of myths here. And there's innumerable others, but I'll just mention a few here. There's creation myths that describe the founding of a religion, the culture of the world. I would argue that creation myths engage in this term that we use in sci-fi writing called world building. It's the same sort of move that a sci-fi author does. Then there's the hero tale. In the hero tale, the hero leaves home, he adventures in a foreign land, he has temptation, he has a battle with an adversary, he discovers a new insight or a Gnostic revelation, he understands the truth of something, then he returns home and establishes new traditions or innovations. You can think about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which Kripal does, but I like to think about Star Wars, and this journey of the hero is very much the journey of Luke Skywalker in the original Star Wars. And to note, George Lucas, when he was writing the Star Wars movies, he was reading and talking quite a bit to Joseph Campbell, who was a writer about myth in the 20th century. He wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's an important book. I think it's a little overly simplistic, but that's me. Also, Skywalker, Kachari. Kachari is one who travels in the sky, is a tantric hero in Hinduism. Also, Yodha means warrior. There's a fair amount of Hinduism and quite a bit of religion in general, religious themes and myth themes that you can find in the Star Wars mythos. And finally, trickster gods. Trickster gods are unruly entities that sort of challenge the status quo. I mean, I'm going to mention them here. Most world religions courses do like 3 weeks on trickster gods because people like them, but I would like to rather talk about Deadpool. If you watch the movies Deadpool or read the comic books, you notice that he is self-aware. He shows up. He knows he's in a comic. He makes fun of other characters. And in his challenges to other characters in the convention of the comic book, he moves the plot forward in unexpected ways. Deadpool is a pretty good trickster god. All right, so can we create new myths? And if we do so, are we restructuring our own myths? I have this turtle here because I had a friend in high school who had a dream that he was being chased by a turtle in a lake. And the last time I talked to him, this is some 20 years later, he's still hunting this mythical turtle. And I have several friends that have like been out on lakes with him on a boat being like, I'm gonna find this turtle. And I asked a buddy of mine who also knows him, I says, Jason found the turtle yet? He's like, is it in his mind or is it real? He still seeks it. So can we create new myths? If we do so, are we restructuring our own myths? If myths create our sense of the world, what happens when our myths change? What happens when you change your mind or when you convert to another religion? Can you accept myths you weren't raised with? If we are creatively thinking about myth and religion, can we rewrite the religion that determines us? Is there such thing as being active versus passive as a religious person? I think anyone that tells a tale that gives new insights into the world is creating mythology. However, there's a difference between something that's just a story that you tell and something that becomes sort of a personal mythology. Personal mythology requires that story to elucidate more than one simple meaning, but to make sense of one's place in the world. I mean, is it my own personal mythology that I am a scholar? Maybe. Is it more of my personal mythology that I come from a long line of pig farmers and laborers? So I see myself as a scholar who uses the tools of labor within my academic practice. Then we're getting more towards mythology. All right, breakdown. So Jeff Kripal does one comparative move that I'm going to walk you through really quick on the founders of Buddhism and Jainism. So the interesting thing here is that both of these characters sort of they founded a new religion. That religion was based on their attainment. They established communities of monks on both sides. Those monks follow their behavior and example. So we learn about the foundation of a religion. We learn about the social structure of a religion. We learn about ideas from the earliest strata of that religion. But also remember, with these religious biographies, the biography of the Buddha that we have that most people read is by Ashwagosha, and it was written almost 1,000 years after his death. The first biographic information we have about Mahavira at all is over 100 years after his death. So Mahavira on the left, his name means great hero. He left home at the age of 30. He undertook extreme asceticism, and he pushed himself very, very hard. And when he had any doubts or temptation, he would just work harder and harder and harder. And eventually he receives omniscience. So that's the major sign of attainment of liberation, is he's able to know everything. He establishes a community, and he taught for years and years. And then he dies and attains a state of, how to put it? Jain enlightenment is you ascend out of the body, and the soul is not connected to the material world in any way. And then it lives in this perfected place where it doesn't act. And the only experience in that place is a swishing of wind. That's all that's said to be there. Now, the Buddha, whose name means the awakened one, left home at age 30, similar, undertook extreme asceticism, again, and there's an argument that he went and actually did become a Jain renunciate for a while. But he realized that he was wasting away from this extreme religious practice he was doing. So a little girl comes by and offers him some food. He takes that food. And then he realized the middle way between extreme asceticism and extreme indulgence. So he says, just take enough food that your body can be comfortable and that you can support your own practice. So he is tempted by an entity that comes to him named Mara and offers him all the glories of the world. And he says, nope. And soon he attains awakening. He attains omniscience, sarvagna, same term. Then he lives his life preaching, same way. Intriguingly, both the Buddha and Mahavir have sort of supernatural ways of speaking, such as that Mahavir, there's one argument that his teachings just radiated out from him and his lips didn't move, but anyone would understand them and even animals would understand them. The Buddha was said to physically speak, but they said that he had this sort of power that even animals and people that spoke other languages would understand him. So both of them had a sense that they just emanated their very teachings. The Buddha lived his life teaching, preaching, established a monastic order, just as Mahavir did, and he later died, maybe by food poisoning or by actual poisoning, and then he became absent. But unlike Mahavira, Buddhist nirvana is the extinguishing. You're no longer there. The self no longer exists, does not come back in any way, ceases to exist. Whereas in Jainism, the soul moves up into this perfected realm and it doesn't return and it doesn't act in any way, and it just exists in like pure, conscious, luminous light. That's it. Okay, so here we see some comparative patterns. We see that both of them practice extreme asceticism or religious practice. They both had an enlightenment experience that looks really similar. They both had magic Gnostic powers in which they could teach without teaching. They have similar life patterns. Both were not born Brahmins. At the time, theoretically, a lot of the people who were religious were Brahmins, but both of these were Kshatriyas from a warrior caste. They were both Shramanas or strivers. So during the time period that they were alive, which was about 500 years BCE, 600, there was groups of people called Shramanas or strivers, and they were just people who went to the woods to do religious practices. Both of them did that. They both established a sangha or religious community. They had unnatural births, and that the Buddha was born without pain, and he stepped 7 steps and said, I will become enlightened in this lifetime. Mahavir was supposedly conceived in the womb of a Brahmin, but was moved by the gods into the womb of a Kshatriya. The idea between both of these, and this is said about both of these figures, was that they had to be Kshatriya warrior class because they had the karma to either become kings of the universe or enlightened sages. So to be a Kshatriya, you could do both of those things. If you're a Brahmin, you could never become a king. So what do these similarities show us? They show us similar patterns and founders, community, the time period. There's tons of comparisons here to learn about the time period of India, the nature of these two religions, the nature of what it means to be a founder of a religion. Okay. One curious little side note I just wanted to make is Buddhism goes around the world. I mean, it's practiced all over the place, but Jainism never left India. So it makes you wonder, why is that the case? Maybe it's because Jain religious practice is just so intense and Buddhist practice is just so gentle. I wouldn't call it gentle, but it's more gentle than Jainism. Also, all of the events, and you could put this into a comparison as well, all of these events that I described in these two figures' lives are commemorated in yearly festivals that map about the same time. So Jains celebrate, the Mahavir's birth, his enlightenment, his renunciation, and his death. Buddhists do the exact same. All right, so now we're on to ritual. Ritual is, and so here we have some rituals. We have Mass on the left. We have a Hindu puja, which is ritual worshiping of an icon in which the deity is supposed to be present in that icon and partakes in sharing the devotion of the person who's making the offerings and sharing in the offerings that are made. And what about football? I think football is really interesting. It's a ritual field. We come out, there's rituals surrounding it. We have We sing the national anthem. Everybody comes onto the field. They compete. There's rules. What's ritualistic about sports? I would say plenty. All right. So ritual, from ritualis in the Latin, means relating to sort of religious ceremonies or rites, meaning religious observance, mode of behavior or practice. So a ritual is any sort of religious act or any sort of scripted activity. The idea is there is a specific way to do it, and you have to act it out in that way. But the question is, where does that script come from? Well, it comes from two places. It comes from myths. We often have myths that explain why you do a ritual, but we also have ritual handbooks. So I like to say myth and manual. The question is, how often do these ritual handbooks that describe exactly how to do a ritual have myths within them, or draw from mythological content? That's something for you to dig around and think about a little bit. Okay, so there's a great story about the jaguar in the temple, and this is common in religious studies. We tell this story. This is the thing about myths and rituals. So imagine you have somebody who's doing this grand ritual. There's a whole bunch of people and doing this powerful ritual. In the middle of this ritual they do to worship a god, to get prosperity in the world, but it doesn't matter. In the middle of the ritual, a jaguar comes in, bites a guy, drags him off. So they go, wow, an eruption of the sacred. A new thing happened. I saw something amazing. This jaguar came and ate this guy. So the next time they do the ritual, they look around and there's no jaguar. Well, we need the ritual. We need the jaguar for the ritual to really be done right. So in time, they either put up a jaguar image that goes in that temple that they worship to commemorate the time the jaguar ate the guy, that they saw spirit, that they witnessed the jaguar spirit. Or maybe they have somebody dressed as a jaguar who comes in and grabs one of the priests and drags them out. The point is, tradition only has to be handed down once. Ritual innovation only has to be handed down from one person to become a tradition. So like they would commemorate this jaguar in the temple in a similar way. Like I said, tradition only needs to be handed down once. Okay, so in the field, the idea of studying myth on its own only came up in the late 19th century. We saw in Masuzawa that a lot of the themes in the late 19th century were about religious evolution, classifying religions. They didn't really talk about what do people do. Okay, so rituals, in fact, act out myths. So it's never clear what comes first, the myth or the ritual. Like in almost all my work, I completely study rituals. But if a myth tells us how the world comes into being, then ritual reenacts that myth as a theater, like acting out the creation myth. Or, for instance, let's put it another way and think about the Passion of the Christ and how yearly we act out the Passion of the Christ, in which Christ, we reenact Christ's burial, or his killing, and his not as much as rebirth, that comes in Easter, but in these Passion plays, they reenact like the traumas that Christ had upon crucifixion and persecution. So Kripal gives a little definition of myth and ritual, and he says, myth and ritual constitute a single performance armed at the creative construction of a world to live in and experience as stable, secure, and real. Now, I would wonder, can there be a ritual without a myth? I kind of think there can. Is there a story beneath all rituals? If you look at the ritual and you ask someone a question about why it's done in a certain way, odds are in any culture, they're going to tell you a story. Now, what about other things? If I decide to say, burn the name of my ex-lover on a sheet of paper to get rid of my feelings of connection to that person, well, what's the myth there? We can all see that that's somehow effective. That one makes sense to us inherently, but what's the mythology behind it? Well, maybe it's not one story per se, but plenty of mythemes about the power of the name, the power of writing, the power of burning, and all of these ideas can be seen to have wider mythological themes. All right, so I wanted to talk very briefly about two words that come up quite a bit in this class, which are transcendental and pragmatic. There are two poles of religious ritual. Transcendental rituals act out stories and perform tasks that are not of this world. Let me say that again. So what happens is, in transcendental rites like baptisms, funerals, life cycle rituals, salvation, installing a king, and so forth, you're acting out these themes from myth but you're doing them in order to make something happen or to commemorate something that is not specifically right in front of you, that reforms society, that maintains or glorifies prosperity, which is so much of marriage rituals are about inviting prosperity into our life and reaffirming the notion of marriage. A funeral is done so that we can come together after there's been a disruption or a painful loss. It reaffirms society over the power of death. So you see those aims are towards this greater world, toward a greater societal structure or an interaction with powerful beings that are sort of beyond this world, with beings that are transcendent. Now, pragmatic rituals make changes to this world. These are like petitionary prayers, when you pray for a specific thing, or a petitionary mass, exorcisms, warding off the evil eye, securing specific prosperity, or magic rituals, like I'd said. These are usually performed by an individual or in small groups. The transcendental ones are usually large affairs with lots of people in them. So while these transcendental rituals are public, performed in groups, and are sanctioned, the pragmatic rituals actually tell us more about the worldviews of individuals who are interacting with specific challenges in life. Kripal argues that rituals can be seen in a strong and a weak sense. In the weak sense, a ritual is any systematized social interaction, or so like shaking of hands. That's a good one. You shake hands when you meet, or we used to shake hands when you meet. Fist bumping, any type of social interaction, giving somebody a beer when they walk into your house. Or in Wisconsin, I had this friend from Wisconsin in graduate school, and I was sitting with her I was sitting with her husband, and she came home and she's like, "Michael, how come you haven't cut up any cheese for this man?" And he looks at her because he's from Illinois, and then I looked at him, and we're like, "Oh yeah, she's from Wisconsin." If you're in Wisconsin, people love their cheese, so you always give someone cheese when they walk into your house. I like this ritual. Okay, so in the strong sense, a ritual is any action that connects to superhuman beings or something beyond the human and moves beyond the pragmatic. I remain much more interested in these pragmatic rituals, and I wouldn't say that they're weak versus strong, but that's me. And this sort of, Kripal keeps talking about what you put on the table for the study, and I would argue that he keeps throwing pragmatic rituals off the table because he's more interested in looking at these more transcendental ones. I want to keep pragmatic rituals on the table at all times. So what are some types of rituals? And we're going to go through a bunch of these. So we have liturgical rituals. So you have here, worshiping the monks, having reverence made to them, or, this guy giving the children's sermon, one of my favorite parts of any Protestant sermon. So these honor and worship deities, such as the grand god Jehovah, or the founders, such as worshiping the Buddha on his birthday. What are some other rituals? What about funerary rituals or funeral rituals? So in funerary rituals, like I'd said, these can do a couple of things. In a sociological way, we would see that a funeral represents people having loss, but coming together to reaffirm the nature of society over death. In a more simple way, you could say that these funeral rituals, such as the Hindu rites for the dead, are to integrate the soul of the dead into a heavenly rebirth, or in Hinduism, the land of the fathers. Furthermore, there's a pragmatic end to funeral rituals. They keep ghosts from coming back. If you don't do the funerals right, the restless dead come and torture you. Even in our Western world, we say rest in peace when someone dies, and in our own sort of mythology and horror films, we are always hearing about people who have had improper funerals, not resting in peace and coming back to bother us. So there we have a transcendental understanding of funeral, integrating society together, and a pragmatic one of getting rid of ghosts. Libation rituals. So in a libation rituals, you'll pour liquid over an image, or you'll pour it onto the ground, sort of I remember this in this African religions course, I had a professor who would always talk about the chthonic gods, the gods from under the earth that would be worshipped with, by pouring blood and pouring liquor and whatnot onto the ground. Or very simply, let me pour one out for my dead homies. There you go, libation ritual. So an offering of liquids often into the ground. We see these cross-culturally as well. Vows or vratas. So in this one, I want to get a little bit Indian. So we have this idea of a vrata, which means like you take a vow to say not eat sour foods on Fridays for the goddess Santoshima. This is a goddess of worldly prosperity. So in the vrata days, you don't eat anything sour, and you don't eat anything sour all day. You make the vow that you're not going to eat anything sour on Fridays, and then on Friday night you tell a story with your pals about Santoshima, and hopefully from that vow of giving something up and telling the story, that will invite the blessings of this deity. Let's think similarly to Lent, where we give up something. I often give up drinking for a month for Lent because I think it's a good practice. And people regularly say that they give up something in order to, or like they'll give up social media. I have a friend that did that last year, in order to draw closer to God. So vows. So this can be a vow of giving up something, or it could be a vow to do something. They're in South India. As you see these pictures over here, you see people carrying these heavy bundles of sticks that are wrapped up, and they call this kavadi. And you'll make a vow like, I want to have a son, so I will do kavadi, where I carry this very heavy thing in a ritual procession, so in a ritual parade. So kavadi. I should have got some more pictures of that. Okay, what about social rituals? So think about social rituals. Did I get? Okay, well, I don't have pilgrimage, so I'll mention pilgrimage. So pilgrimage is when you go to a place that is not your home for religious reasoning. Maybe you walk there. Maybe you vow to walk there. This could be a sacred place, could be to Mecca. People often talk about Disneyland as a pilgrimage that people in the West make, as in no childhood is complete unless they go to Disneyland. So each is a journey that is in search of some type of communion or communication with whatever you are going to visit and with the people around you. So people often go on pilgrimage in groups. And in that group pilgrimage, you find that social bonds sort of dissolve. And there's wonderful stories about Malcolm X going to Mecca on his pilgrimage on the Hajj. And he said at that point, he met all of these white Muslims, and he was able to see Muslims beyond their race when he saw all of those Muslims come together, every ethnicity, to go on a pilgrimage. This is something that happens often on pilgrimages. I know I once almost got into a fight with a gentleman at the beginning of a pilgrimage, and then by the end of it, we were fast friends. There's something that happens when you go on these religious journeys together. What about social rituals, such as holidays? I think is a good one. So we have two holidays put together. We have on the left in India, this is in Gujarat. You can see that folks are coming together to dance and sing and enjoy one another on, I believe this is on Krishna's birthday. And on the right, you have that most quintessential of all holidays for the United States. We have all of our rituals around Christmas coming together. Santa Claus slaying a vicious tree and decorating its bloated corpse in our living room. Bundt cake. Christmas rituals, social rituals. All of these are rituals. Or magic rituals, which we studied so much last week. And I just wanted to bring them back up because those are great rituals that you do specific things to make specific changes in the world. All right, so what about some other ones? I'm going to run to India here again, talk about life cycle rituals. These are called sanskaras, which literally means putting things together. In Indian cultures, you have like the first time a baby has solid food, the first haircut, the piercing of the ears in the south. Then you have the tying on of the sacred cord, upanayanam, so one can begin to become a student. Then you have marriage and becoming a householder and the head of your own household. Finally, you have leaving your own household and turning it over to your son. And funeral rituals. What are our big Western rituals? Well, we have the first day of school every year, in which it's ubiquitous and you have to take a picture now and put it on social media of your kids. Getting a driver's license is a really good one. Starting to vote, graduation rituals, your first house, what happens when you retire, your own death. These are all sort of rituals of the life cycle. Civil religion, this is a fascinating idea. So there's a guy named Robert Bellah, and he died a few years back, who posited that there are ways in which secular or non-religious governing authorities use traditional religious means, rituals, tendencies in order to provide stability and establish order. These sort of secular rituals of government and society are used to establish that our society is perfect just the way it is, to give sort of founding mythology almost to our religious world, so, or to our secular world. So think about the fact that we have "In God We Trust" on our money, but in fact, that's only been there since 1954. But we have a religious invocation to support our monetary system and the authority of our government. Our founding fathers are all thought to be good Protestants, but when you look back, and some of them are downright, I mean, they were deists. Some of them were, like Ben Franklin was a very kooky guy. Even if you look deep, a lot of them were Freemasons. So they weren't, you know, your standard, they weren't just your standard mega church Protestants like we would think of them. But we also think of our founding fathers as sort of like people think of the Buddha or Mahavir as those who founded this perfect religion. We think of them as founding this perfect country. What about civil religion? Well, think about sort of the things that we imagine when we think about our country, and think about how they have religious vibes. Like, what about the holidays? 4th of July very much feels a lot like Easter in a way that we do it every year. It has specific rituals. You eat hot dogs, fireworks, flags. All of these symbols and rituals are similar to religious rituals. Kripal makes this point about the weirdness of our civil religion and the fact that we believe that borders exist. It's just a line in the ground. It doesn't inherently exist in any way. So this house can be on the USA and Canada, but it's still just a house, whether it's a US house or a Canadian house. So think about the ways that flags, the way we think about military battles. You know, I was touring Gettysburg last year and thinking about its hallowed ground because so many Americans died there. So we have a sense of how we make sense of our world, and we use religious themes, but we use them to justify non-religious ideas. And what about Thanksgiving as such a national holiday that has communal feast, founding BS myths about Native Americans helping out the Pilgrims? So yeah, we have lots of sort of intriguing religious sounding stuff that aren't religious. Now, what about, Kripal gives these great examples of taking a knee. What does it mean to kneel? Well, traditionally people would kneel in submission to a king. So why do folks in a democracy maintain monarchy rituals? So in the early Jewish faith, God was considered a king and angels were considered soldiers. So you better bow down in front of them. They're using that, and in that sense, we see that the world of the cosmos is mirrored on our relationships between kings and kings and subjects. The Christian prayer pose traditionally was standing with the knees, or standing with your legs locked and your elbows kind of in, your hands out like that, kind of like this person here. But it was only in the time that the Romans connected with the Christian church that people began to kneel in a religious manner when they would have only kneeled in the past when they were greeting a king. In Hinduism, you have people will touch the feet of their elders, of your teacher, of your guru. So this is sort of like a ritualized submission, but people would also, you'll notice that when you're reading in Sanskrit, people talk about touching and worshiping feet of kings in the same way that they talk about touching and worshiping the feet of deities. In Buddhism, specifically in Tibetan Buddhism, they do what these things are called are prostrations or Tibetan push-ups, and you have them being demonstrated by this old guy here. So you'll do those 5 times every time you see an image of the Buddha in a religious context, every time you meet your teacher or your lama, every time you reenact taking refuge. So taking refuge is a vow to put your sort of faith and devotion towards the Buddha as the example of the enlightened person, the Sangha, the community of monks, and the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. Then there's this wonderful description that Kripal gives about how in Muslim prayer, the Shiites and the Sunnis have this different little bit of practice. There's this one where they cross their hands like this. This was evidently picked up because once the Arabs had conquered, the early Muslims had conquered the Persian Empire, they saw them doing this practice, so they would meet a king. And they thought, oh, let's do that kingly meeting practice in meeting with God. Now, to get a little wacky on this one, I got to thinking about all of this knees and kneeling, and I got to thinking about football again. I thought about Tim Tebow and Colin Kaepernick. So prayer, submission, and kneeling. Tim Tebow does his prayer every time he scores a goal or every time he walks on the field or whatnot. He prays. Everybody's very excited about that. So he's praying and asking God that God might have him do well and his team be triumphant, or he's praying and thanking God for the strength to be triumphant. So he is submitting himself to God with the goal of being excellent in the game and revering the human existence for having the possibility of the game. Colin Kaepernick, on the other hand, kneels while the American flag is being displayed and the national hymn is being performed. But one would say, is he kneeling in rejection of the flag? Or is he kneeling in submission to God, asking God for racial harmony in the United States? Well, what about when somebody says, take a knee? When the coach says, take a knee, and all the players kneel down, and they look to the coach, paying attention to the coach. So in all of these, there's submission, there's prayer. And one wonders, when you oppose Colin Kaepernick, who kneels to offer a prayer for racial harmony, one people would argue. Others would say he's kneeling in defiance, though I'm not quite sure how kneeling in defiance works, because kneeling is submission, versus Tim Tebow taking a knee in order to show reverence to God for his good fortunes. So these are some things to kick around. All right, what about some other rituals? There is, of course, sacrifice. Now, sacrifice, from the various Greek and Latin terms, sacrificium, sacrificare, sacrificare, sacrifice makes a thing sacred. Sacred means set apart. Now, when we looked at Durkheim before, he talked about how religion is about the sacred and what is to be what is to be seen as being sort of beyond the world. It is our religion is our way of interacting with the sacred, and he also talks a lot about totems and taboos, the things that we consider religiously good and religiously bad, and how we manage those things. So sacrifice is intriguing because sacrifice sets something apart from the world. When you sacrifice an animal, then it is no longer a worldly animal, but it has become an offering to the gods. Now, sacrifice usually has to do with, or is rooted in, blood sacrifice. The animal is killed, and this is done all over the world, from Greek culture into our contemporary world, and there is an argument quite thoroughly through Christianity that Christ is a sacrifice and his blood was shed for the sins of the world. But sacrifice isn't usually atonement, but it is an offering. Note that in animal sacrifice, in pretty much every culture in the world, the animal is eaten afterwards. People, Westerners, generally look at animal sacrifice and say, oh, that's so gross. How dare you kill those animals? Well, they killed them and eat them. So it's no different than you eating a cheeseburger. So sacrifice is not wasteful in any means. Blood is generally considered a high offering, but it is also impure. So in Vedic sacrifice, when they slaughter a cow or a horse, in fact, they strangle it and say it's quieted, because if the blood was spilled, then the blood would make the whole ritual space impure. In other places, the blood is considered to be inherently sacred. So we have like the notion of Christ as blood sacrifice. My father always used to talk about this verse in Romans, where we talk about Christ and blood sacrifice, and how earlier blood sacrifices would have to be in these jars that had a point on the bottom, so you couldn't set them down. You'd get the blood immediately from the animal and have to immediately offer it to God. There could be no spot in between. This is the same. He had this argument about the blood of Christ being sort of like that. I never quite understood. Anyway, I would say that, so I told you in the Vedic sacrifice, they would strangle the horse. But in the sacrifices that I attend all over the Himalayas in northern India, the animal's throat is cut, and immediately they spray the blood from the animal's throat, whether it's a chicken or a goat or whatever, onto the deity itself. So in sacrifice, a lot of people say that the original sacrifice would be human sacrifice, but we see very little evidence of human sacrifice around the world. But we do have the notion that anytime someone does a sacrifice, they say, oh, this is equivalent to a human sacrifice. So there are substitutions. So while we went from a primordial human sacrifice to a stand-in that is an animal, and then they'll go even further and say, oh, I'm offering a coconut, which is the equivalent of the animal's head. So people have substitutions. So when you offer a coconut in Hinduism, It has this resonance with an animal's head, which has a resonance with the primordial sacrifice of the grand man in the Purusha Sukta, that cosmic man who's sacrificed in that legend. So sacrifice is generally set up as a system of exchange. Do odes, I give so that you will give. This theorist Mauss argued this, that we do sacrifice as a gift to God so that God will give unto us. So in this, we also get an understanding of how gifts work, in the sense that we don't give gifts, in a sense we give debts. So anytime you give a gift to someone, you also give them a debt that they have to repay. And that's how sort of transactions can work in daily life and in religion. I would add that a lot of sacrificial rituals aren't in this exchange. It's the sense that the god is hungry and the god likes to eat, I don't know, coconuts. So you give the god coconuts and the god's not hungry anymore. So maybe he'll be nice to you. So it's not exactly an exact exchange. I give this, so you give this, but it's like, I give this to you so you don't mess me up and you're in a good mood. Okay, let's move on to divination. This is the last thing I want to talk about today. So divination. Now, we could talk about the history of oracles, or as Kripal calls them, psychics. In the history of Greek culture, you have someone called the Pythia, who was goddess of Apollo, and she would sit in a sacred place, and she would sit on a they talk about this three-cornered, or this three-footed stool that she would sit in, and she would hold laurels, and then there would be this smoke that would naturally arise, and then she could tell you the future. So I'm not going to talk about oracles and psychics. I want to talk about specific techniques for divining something. To divine something is to sort of see its future. I don't know if you've ever heard of a divining rod or a dowsing rod. This is prominent throughout the United States. You'll see these people, they'll take these two forks and they'll walk with them, and when the forks move, underneath there will be water or maybe treasure. So to divine what is under the surface of the earth, or divine where there is water. So divination, or to divine, is a practice to intuit, predict, or fathom the future. Now, I would argue that divination rituals are some of the most common rituals in every religious culture around the world. But we really downplay them in the West, despite for dream interpretation. You hear a lot about that. Astrology, it's in all our newspapers. Palm reading, I bet you can find a palm reader near you. Bible code, which is where people believe you can read the Bible and find, by looking at certain ciphers or codes, you can find hidden messages. To some degree, people do tarot or hearing voices through scripture. My mother does this practice. She reads the Bible and she waits for an insight to come, and she believes it's God speaking to her. So these are, while Christians have traditionally said that divination is demonic, in reality, we see divination sort of all over the world. Some folks argue that Christianity does not allow, certain sects of Christianity doesn't allow playing cards, because playing cards are the equivalent of tarot cards, or cards to divine the future. However, I will note to you that tarot cards aren't that old. They're only a couple hundred years old, and the regulations against cards is a lot earlier than that in Christian theology. The Torah argues against Canaanites who performed divination, but when we look through the Hebrews, we're generally against everything the Canaanites did. The Christians really started denying divination during the missionary and colonial period, so the last, 400 years, demonstrating the importance of divination for these cultures. If everywhere the missionaries went, they said, oh, divination is bad, it means that they encountered divination everywhere. So divination and divination rites to tell the future or inquire something that is unknown are quite common. These days, Christians deny divination, but they actually tend to use a fair bit of astrology. If you look through the Farmer's Almanac, you'll find quite a bit of astrology. You have the Bible code, as I said, and people receive visions while reading the scriptures. This is how a lot of the prophecies about the end of the world come up, such as these find within the Jehovah's Witnesses. And even people resort to, and this is intriguing to me, there is I talked to a few people that do this. They use angel cards. This is a modified version of tarot with angels on it that Christians feel are a-okay. So prophecies, portents, and omens. So we hear about prophecy in the Bible, but in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian Bible, when they talk about prophets, you're not talking about someone who told the future. They were always saying, all this will happen unless you turn to God. So the prophets weren't as much telling the future as telling people that unless they got their crap together and turned right with God, there would be huge problems. Well, what's a portent? A portent is like if you see a comet, or you see in Indic traditions, there's a text called the Artha Shastra, and it describes all these portents. And it's like if you see an animal acting strangely, if you see fire in the sky, if you see this star blink, these are all portents. A portent is a sign that leads to something else that's bad. Or an omen can be sort of like an animal behavior that shows something that is going to occur. To extend this, you could have augury. Augury is cutting open animals in sacrificial cultures. This is practiced around the world in order to read their livers or their pancreases or whatnot, and differences on the insides of their body. And that would lead to you realizing something or other is going to happen. In the early Chinese culture, they would burn bones and then interpret the cracks in the bones to figure out what the future would be. So back to China, you have the I Ching, which is one of the oldest systems of divination, starting around 200 BCE. And in this, you throw coins or you throw sticks in order to create these hexagrams, as you see here around the yin and yang. And then by looking at these hexagrams, you would figure out and interpret them according to the 64 diagrams in the I Ching. I've never been able to figure out the I Ching. I have some friends that use it pretty effectively, but I've never been able to figure out the technology and how to really interpret those hexagrams well. But it's a very old system. So when I'm talking about divination, I am not talking about people who just sort of look and get an image in their head and say something. In divination techniques, you need something that you support, that you read. So whether it's these sticks that you throw on the ground in order to read their patterns, or whether you have this pendulum here, which is people hold it and it swings, and depending on whether it goes one way or the other, it means something differently. What I'm looking at when I talk about divination techniques is not the power to see the future that someone inherently has, such as by looking into the black, dark mirror in their head, but ways of reading things in order to tell something. Divination is reading. It's interpreting. Now, Kripal argues that truly what divination is all about is the interaction between the client and the diviner, so they can sort of read the client and give them some telling of the future. I would say that divination is less reading that interaction, but reading that technological support for the divination. All right, we're at its end, but let's look to the future. So for our next lesson, we're going to look at one specific ritual from originally found in the Rig Veda. So it's a very early ritual from the Hindu tradition, in which they will build a giant brick bird, and they will install the soul of the one who is sanctioning or giving all the money for the sacrifice into the bird, and then that person will gain heaven upon their death. This is called the Agni Chayana, or the building up of the fire. So they make all these bricks, they make all their own ritual implements, and then at the end of it, they burn all their implements and smash all the bricks. There are various elements of sacrifice throughout this, and I want you to look at the video we will watch and the readings that will support it, and ask yourself, well, do they actually kill animals or not? I also want you to look, because we're going to watch this video about one of these rituals being performed in the 1970s, and then we're going to read some ethnographies by two anthropologists who are writing in a contemporary Vedic culture. And I want you to think about what's the difference between writing about something and watching it on a video or recording it on a video. So we're going to look at one very particular and very famous rite from ancient India. So I will see you next time.